They say he was brave, they say he was righteous, they say he slept beside the King of France. Richard the Lionheart, crusader, killer, crowned legend, left behind blood, myth, and whispers. Was it politics? Was it love? Was it something we just can't say out loud? This is not a story about proving a king was gay. This is a story about why we keep needing to ask. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really provocative question. Was Richard the Lionheart a queer king? And maybe more importantly, why does it matter who medieval men loved? Our mission for this deep dive is to explore this. We'll be sifting through historical sources, scrutinizing what the chroniclers actually wrote, delving into the often quite heated modern scholarly debates, and grounding it all within the broader context of medieval sexuality and power, especially during that whole tumultuous era of the Crusades. We're aiming for a nuanced, maybe even myth-busting narrative here. We want to be careful, avoid slapping modern labels where they don't quite fit, but we also want to illuminate some previously overlooked and honestly often fascinating dimensions of history. So when most of us think of Richard the Lionheart, what comes to mind? It's usually that image, right? The quintessential medieval war hero.
Absolutely, the legendary Crusader king.
Yeah, powerful, maybe a bit of an absentee king for England, but still, this figure carved into English nationalism.
He's iconic. His legacy, the traditional one, it seems pretty solid. Etched in stone, you could say.
Celebrated everywhere, from Robin Hood stories to, serious history books. But what if there's more to it? Something that maybe challenges that neat, heroic picture.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Because beneath that public image, that valiant warrior king, there have always been these whispers about his private life.
Right. So he ruled like a man, but what did that even mean back in, 1190?
That's the core question, isn't it? Because man and masculinity in the medieval period, it was way more intricate than our modern understanding often allows for, especially when we start talking about intimacy. And one of the big pieces of evidence, the one that really sparked this whole modern debate, it comes from a chronicler, Roger of Howden.
Okay, Roger of Howden, what did he say?
He detailed this remarkable great closeness between Richard and Philip II of France.
Great closeness. Sounds intriguing.
It wasn't just a passing comment. Howden specifically noted that during their alliance in 1187, and this was a really tense time, Richard was actually at war with his own father, Henry II. During that time, Richard and Philip ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them.
Wow. Okay. Eating from the same dish, sleeping in the same bed. That paints a pretty striking picture, doesn't it? Very intimate.
It does.
How are we supposed to read that now from our modern perspective in a context that feels so, different?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital to get the medieval norm here, but also how this specific account might actually depart from that norm. Bed sharing among nobles, it was actually quite common.
Oh, really?
Yeah, sometimes just practical, limited space, travel, even just keeping warm. But often it had a really profound symbolic function.
Symbolic how?
It was seen as a symbolic representation of trust and alliance, a big declaration of unity, of confidence in each other.
Right, makes sense. Political alliances back then were very personal.
Exactly. So sharing that intimate space, even if it wasn't sexual, was a powerful way to cement those bonds. And we have other examples, like Henry II himself, Richard's father. He apparently shared a bed with his most loyal knight, William Marshal. And no chronicler suggested anything sexual there.
Okay, so on surface, Richard and Philip, it could just be politics as usual.
It could. But, and here's the crucial nuance, the thing that fuels the debate, it's about the framing, how chroniclers like Howden wrote about it, and the reaction it caused.
What reaction?
Well, specifically, the palpable alarm it caused in Richard's father, Henry II. Howden notes Henry was alarmed by their closeness.
Alarmed why? Just politically threatened?
Partly, yes. He definitely feared being politically boxed in, losing control over Richard. But the way Howden emphasizes it, the fact that chroniclers chose to highlight this specific detail and the strong reaction it provoked, it suggests that maybe medieval observers saw something deeper, perhaps an intensely emotional bond, maybe even a sexual one, something threatening to the normal patriarchal authority, the royal order.
So the chroniclers themselves might have suspected it was sexual.
Some historians argue exactly that they evidently had reason to believe that it was in fact sexual, even if they couldn't just come out and say it. Societal norms, professional constraints, and this ties into a real problem in modern debate, this demand for concrete proof when we talk about pre-modern queer relationships.
Meaning what kind of proof? Explicit descriptions?
Yeah, explicit details of sexual acts. But interestingly, That's a standard we rarely apply to heterosexual relationships from the same period. We just assume those based on context.
That's a really powerful point. The selective demand for proof. It's not just what happened, but how it was seen and recorded. And speaking of perceptions and records, this brings us to Richard's public confessions. You mentioned this is where it gets really interesting.
It certainly does. Roger of Howden, again, he gives us these intriguing glimpses into Richard's spiritual life, or maybe his public performance of atonement. Howden records Richard publicly repenting for thorns of lustfulness. This was in Sicily, 1191.
Thorns of lustfulness, okay.
And then he did it again for sexual misdeeds in 1195 and again in 1198, publicly.
Public repentance. What's so unusual about that for a king?
Well, according to some scholars, the really noteworthy thing is that any act of repentance for extramarital sex with women, especially for a king, was simply unheard of.
Unheard of. But kings had mistresses, illegitimate children all the time, didn't they?
Absolutely. And the church certainly frowned on it. But public displays of royal remorse for heterosexual affairs, extremely rare, basically non-existent.
Oh, so the thinking is, if kings didn't publicly repent for sleeping with women,
Then Richard's very public penance might have been public atonement for queer sexual sins, precisely because it was so unusual for a king to confess this kind of lustfulness in public.
and that phrase, thorns of lustfulness, did it have a specific meaning?
It carried specific connotations of sexual excess or misbehavior for medieval moralists. It often referred to a kind of generalized but deeply troubling sexual appetite that deviated from what was considered normal or acceptable.
Okay, so if a king confessed publicly, unprecedentedly, to lustfulness, and it likely wasn't about standard heterosexual affairs, what else could it be? What are the common, maybe, misconceptions we might have about what lustfulness meant then, and how does Richard's situation challenge those?
That's a great question. Because lustfulness, or luxuria in Latin, it was a broad category for medieval moralists. It covered pretty much any form of unbridled sexual desire or excess. So a common misconception today might be to assume it always meant heterosexual sin.
Right.
And some historians, like John Gillingham, make that counterargument. They suggest references to Sodom, or these thorns of lustfulness, were just broad condemnations, maybe unbridled lechery in general, or divine anger for general sinfulness, not specifically homosexuality.
So maybe not targeted at same-sex acts specifically.
They might argue that. They
Yeah.
could point to Richard's famously childless marriage to Berengaria of Navarre. Chroniclers did note he neglected his marital duties.
Which could be seen as sinful in itself, failing his duty.
In a general sense, yes. Or just not fulfilling his dynastic role, which a hermit or preacher might rebuke him for.
But you're saying the key insight lies elsewhere.
I think it lies in the public nature of these repeated repentances. For sexual misdeeds, for thorns of lustfulness. When you stack that up against the almost total lack of similar royal penance for heterosexual infidelity, it really suggests a transgression that was seen as particularly bad, egregious, unusual, maybe even scandalous for a king.
More scandalous than just standard lechery.
It implies a distinct societal concern with certain types of sexual behavior, even for monarchs. Royal behavior, even private stuff, was under intense scrutiny, morally and religiously. Different sins clearly carried different social and political weight. And the fact these confessions were so public suggests a concern that went beyond the usual eye-rolling about a king's private life.
So it makes you ask.
Exactly. It prompts us to ask, what specific kind of lustfulness would be so shocking, so atypical for a king, that he'd feel compelled, or maybe be compelled, to publicly repent? Not once, but multiple times. The very act, especially for unspecified sexual misdeeds, feels like it could be a coded reference. Something his contemporaries might have understood as more unnatural or scandalous than just sleeping around with women.
That's a really powerful point. It challenges our assumptions about what was normal or sinful back then, which brings us to a wider view, doesn't it? To really get Richard's world, we need to understand how medieval people even thought about love, intimacy, relationships, which was, well, pretty different from how we categorize things today.
Absolutely. To really grasp the nuances around Richard, we absolutely have to zoom out. Look at the broader landscape of medieval male intimacy. And it's crucial, I think, to distinguish between two concepts we tend to mush together today: homosexuality and homoeroticism, especially in that knightly culture.
Okay, let's break this down. Homosexuality.
Right. Homosexuality refers to social interaction, bonding between members of the same sex. It's characterized by open displays or gestures of mutual concern, emotion, or affection. Eve Kostovsky-Sedgwick really helped define this, distinguishing it from explicit homosexuality. It's about intense male bonding. Interestingly, this could exist right alongside a fear, even a hatred, of actual homosexuality.
So strong male friendships, basically.
Yes, but often intensely emotional ones.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating in a military context is how this strong bonding, even behaviors seen as feminine elsewhere, got appropriated into the masculine identity of the warrior class. It became part of the brotherhood ideal. It doesn't automatically mean sex, but it can definitely create a space where erotic feelings might arise.
Okay, and homoeroticism.
Similar, but specifically characterized by male-male physicality, bodily acts, and sexual encounters instead of mere social interaction. It implies sexual or romantic attraction, even if they didn't use our modern word homosexuality. Now think about military life back then, especially during the Crusades. Almost exclusively male environments for centuries.
Right. Constant close quarters.
Exactly. That inherently fostered intense male bonding, very strong homosocial environments. The whole brotherhood idea was absolutely vital for loyalty, unit cohesion, just basic survival in battle. And the Crusades themselves, they were this huge outlet for Europe's youth and aggression, which probably intensified these bonds even further. Shared danger, being far from home, brutal campaigns.
Living and dying together, essentially.
Precisely. Close quarters, shared dangers, relying on each other for everything. It created conditions ripe for deep emotional connections and sometimes physical ones too.
So this isn't just about the practical side of war, but how these intense relationships were actually viewed, even valued, within medieval society itself.
Exactly right. Medieval literature, which knights and courtly audiences loved, often stressed the importance of affectionate, loving friendship between men. This wasn't just sort of tolerated. It was often seen as something that enhanced virtue. It was considered a central part of warrior masculinity.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think of the French epic poem, Ami et Emile. When the two knight friends reunite, it's with passionate embraces. Displays of affection that might seem overtly romantic, maybe even sexual to us today, but were culturally acceptable then as part of deep male friendship.
Any others?
Or consider Lancelot and Galehaut in the Arthurian legends. Galehaut's deep affection for Lancelot is a major driver of the story, and Richard the Lionheart's own much commented on friendship with Philip II, the shared meals, the shared bed. It perfectly fits this pattern of intense political and personal bonds between powerful men.
And these displays of affection didn't make them seem less manly.
Generally not. What's really striking is that this kind of vulnerability, this vulnerability to love, could be a form of strength. It showed loyalty, which is absolutely essential for a knight. It wasn't seen as undermining their warrior status. But this creates a fascinating paradox. Militaries, on the one hand, they upheld these heterosexual, hypermasculine norms, strength, duty, having heirs. But paradoxically, they also integrate homosocial, homoerotic, and feminized behaviors within their practices.
Wait, feminized behaviors?
Yeah, things like intense emotional expression, physical closeness. When these happened within the brotherhood, they were sort of appropriated into the masculine identity. They became acceptable, even celebrated. But if the same behaviors were practiced by people seen as feminized or outside that specific military context, they'd be condemned.
So a double standard.
A definite tension, yeah. Intense male intimacy was celebrated as brotherly virtue, but at the same time, it was policed against becoming explicitly homoerotic, especially if it seemed to challenge the patriarchal order or church teachings. It was a real tightrope walk.
It sounds like a world full of unwritten rules, unspoken understandings. If you couldn't directly express certain desires because they were forbidden, where did these powerful feelings go? How did they find a voice, slip past the censors?
That's where medieval literature and other cultural practices become so incredibly revealing, often more revealing than the formal histories. Because same-sex acts were illegal, often severely condemned, queer narratives had to be carefully constructed to be covert.
Covert how? Hidden messages?
Exactly, using subtext, allusion, metaphor, subtle coding. Ways to express desire that could bypass overt censorship but still be understood by those who were, in the know. The fact these narratives exist, even if often overlooked, shows a much more diverse Middle Ages than we usually imagine. It challenges that idea of a completely repressed, strictly heterosexual society.
Can you give an example from literature?
A really glaring example of queer desire explored is in the famous poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Ah, yes, go on.
In the story, the main male characters, Gawain and Bertolic, who's also the Green Knight, they exchange multiple kisses.
Kisses between knights.
Yes. And they're depicted as casual and culturally normative. No one bats an eye. Even when Gawain, as part of this strange game, literally transfers kisses he got from Bertalic's wife onto Bertalic himself.
Whoa. Okay, that's something.
It really illustrates that affectionate embraces between late medieval noblemen, even erotically charged ones, are culturally normative. The erotic charge there comes from the context, right? Receiving kisses from a woman, delivering them to a man. It blurs the lines of standard courtly love, suggesting this playful but definitely present subtext of male physical intimacy.
Wow. Hidden in plain sight, almost. Any other examples?
Another fascinating one is how the story of David and Jonathan from the Bible was used.
The biblical figures.
Yes, their love, described in Scripture as surpassing the love of women, became a common reference point, especially in poems written by religious men like Baudry de Breguet or Marbot of Rennes.
How is it used?
Scholars have identified it as functioning like a kind of gay slang of the era.
Slang? Really?
Yeah, a shared, coded way of talking about same-sex love among certain circles. It suggests the existence of what some historians call a gay subculture, a network of people aware of their shared difference, influencing how they saw themselves and others.
Using the Bible as coded language. That's pretty clever.
It shows how deeply these ideas were woven into the culture, even finding expression within seemingly conservative religious frameworks. And then you also have the Neo-Latin poets around the 11th and 12th centuries. They were influenced by classical Roman literature, which had more open depictions of homoerotic love. So these poets often portrayed male love positively, but they did it while carefully avoiding explicitly mentioning homosexuality, which was still a taboo topic.
So hinting at it without saying the forbidden word.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A delicate balancing act between expressing desire and getting around the censors, speaking volumes without being explicit.
So it's like these things were there under the surface if you knew how to read the signals. What does all this covert expression tell us about medieval masculinity itself and about repression? Was it absolute?
It tells us that medieval masculinity, especially within that whole chivalry and knighthood context, was really complex, often contradictory. Sure, the romantic ideal of a white knight with his fair lady became popular then, but it's crucial to remember heterosexuality was not the only notion of existence explored. The code of chivalry evolved, emphasizing Christian warrior virtues, loyalty, forbearance, hardiness. But that code didn't necessarily shut the door on diverse forms of male intimacy. In fact, as we've seen, it often provided a framework for really profound male bonding, which sometimes blurred into the homoerotic.
And did it go beyond just male bonding? What about gender expression?
That's another interesting layer. There are significant examples of gender nonconformity that hint at a more fluid understanding. Consider how Jesus was sometimes portrayed in medieval art and writing.
Jesus.
Sometimes depicted behaving in what were considered womanly ways. Things like nursing the soul at her breasts, drying its tears, giving birth to it in agony and travail.
Wow, Jesus depicted as nursing or giving birth.
Yes. This effeminate portrayal of Jesus, who is the ultimate male role model for Christians, suggests that gender nonconformity was acceptable, at least to a certain extent.
It sort of opened a door for men to act in ways we might see as nonconforming without it automatically being a sin or a rejection of their masculinity.
That's surprising. Any other examples?
Well, outside the church, you also see things like cross-dressing in popular activities like carnival and theater. These were temporary, culturally allowed reversals of social and gender norms.
So a bit of flexibility in the system.
It suggests that while official doctrines might have been rigid, actual societal practices and cultural representations allowed for more fluidity than we might think. So putting it all together, despite the undeniable homophobia, which was real and increasing, studies show a range of attitudes to same-sex acts, from unambiguous condemnation to tolerant amusement and even ignorance that they were sinful.
A whole spectrum then, not just black and white. Exactly. A spectrum of societal responses, not uniform rejection. It suggests medieval society held contradictory views, or maybe had a kind of selective blindness sometimes, which means repression wasn't this monolithic, all-powerful force. It was more like a contested space where different norms and behaviors coexisted.
So medieval people weren't necessarily repressed in our modern sense.
Not entirely. It suggests alternative expressions were possible within certain boundaries, often using subtle means. The gap between the official rules and how people actually lived could be surprisingly wide.
That's a truly fascinating picture. Subtle, sometimes covert expressions of intimacy and identity, this tension between outward rules and private or maybe semi-private realities.
Yeah.
But what was the official line? How did the church, which was such a dominant force, actually deal with the gyres it labeled unnatural?
Right, and that's where we see a really significant shift over time, a hardening of attitudes. from relative leniency, or at least inconsistency, towards increasingly severe condemnation. The Catholic Church's views on same-sex acts evolved pretty dramatically through the Middle Ages.
How so? Was it always condemned harshly?
Not initially, not with the same severity. In the early medieval period, say 8th to 11th centuries, homosexuality was often treated more like other sins. Penances were assigned, not usually capital punishment. For example, Pope Gregory III in the 8th century set 160 days of penance for unnatural female acts, and typically about a year for males committing sodomy, maybe more for the passive partner.
So bad, but not the worst thing imaginable.
It wasn't considered good, obviously, but not initially a major crime demanding the harshest penalties. But as Christian theology increasingly emphasized procreative sexuality, sex, primarily for making babies, same-sex encounters became more and more unacceptable. They slowly shifted from being seen as a lesser sin towards being a mortal sin.
So it really escalated. Not just the punishment, but the very definition of the transgression.
It did, profoundly. It became framed as a crime against nature. And this got serious theological and philosophical backing. The 11th century was a real turning point. This is when sodomy starts being viewed not just as a sin, but as a serious moral crime, fundamentally a crime against nature, a violation of God's divine plan for creation.
And specific people pushed this view.
Yes, key theological figures were crucial in solidifying this condemnation. St. Peter Damian wrote his Liber Gomorrhianus, the Book of Gomorrah, in the 11th century. It was a pivotal, really scathing work.
What did it argue?
He strongly condemns homosexuality and masturbation. He portrayed homosexuality, especially among priests, as this corrupting force that was actively undermining morality, religion, society itself, weakening the church's authority. Then in the 12th century, you have Hildegard of Bingen, a very prominent mystic. She reported receiving divine visions condemning same-sex intercourse in her famous work, Civius. That further cemented the idea of God's disapproval.
Okay, so theological heavy hitters were weighing in.
And by the 13th century, the giant figure of Thomas Aquinas provides this powerful philosophical framework linking it all to natural law.
Aquinas, how did he frame it?
In his Summa Theologica, he argued that special sins are against nature, specifically those going against the intercourse of male and female natural to animals. He explicitly called them unnatural vices, a direct violation of God's design.
So worse than other sins.
Aquinas considered sodomy second only to bestiality in terms of abusing sexuality. This really solidified its theological status as a grave offense. It provided the intellectual justification for increasingly harsh legal treatment. It wasn't just morally wrong, it was against the cosmic order.
And what were the real-world consequences? What did this mean for people accused of these acts?
The consequences became brutal. This theological hardening translated directly into increasingly severe legal penalties, often mutilation or death.
Can you give examples?
Look at the Council of Nablus, held in the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1120. After a military defeat, they enacted particularly harsh penalties for sodomy.
Why after a defeat?
It suggests they saw a direct link. Moral decline, especially sexual sin, led to God withdrawing his favor. And for crusaders, moral purity was seen as absolutely crucial for victory, for God's blessing in battle. A defeat could literally be blamed on sins within the ranks.
That's intense. What about in Europe?
By the 13th century in France, the punishments were horrific. Sodomy could mean castration for a first offense, dismemberment for a second, and burning alive for a third, a terrifying escalation.
Burning.
Yes, and by the mid-14th century, many Italian cities had civil laws against sodomy. They even allowed property confiscation, crippling people economically. And much later, but showing the long shadow, England's Buggery Act of 1533 established the death penalty for sodomy. It reflects the ultimate severity and the church's lasting influence on secular law.
Was it just about the sex act itself, or was it linked to other things?
That's a key point. It wasn't usually prosecuted in isolation, especially during the Inquisition, which ramped up in the 13th century. Sodomy accusations were almost always strategically linked with heretical beliefs and attacks on the church.
So sodomy equals heresy.
It became framed that way, seen as a pagan view, a fundamental break in moral and religious views, which then justified capital punishment as both a sexual and religious crime.
So it was politically useful.
Hugely. It highlights the strategic intertwining of sexual and religious deviance for broader political control. The church's stance, shifting from just a sin to a crime against nature, linked to heresy, wasn't just theology. It was a powerful tool for social control, for suppressing perceived threats to Christian order. Especially vital in the Crusade era, where moral purity was tied to military success and divine favor. It became a potent legal and social weapon.
Right, so the laws, the doctrines, they were clear, getting harsher, backed by serious theology. But how did these accusations, especially sodomy, actually play out in real life? Particularly when huge amounts of power and money were involved. There's probably no clearer or more chilling example than the downfall of the Knights Templar.
You're absolutely right. The Templar case is just this stark, almost theatrical example of how accusations of sexual deviance could be weaponized, especially against a powerful homosocial military order.
Remind us who the Templars were.
Founded early 12th century, they grew into one of the most powerful, wealthiest military orders of the Middle Ages. Huge land holdings all over Europe, massive financial influence, almost like an early multinational corporation, but with swords.
So very powerful and therefore a target.
A huge target, particularly for Philip V of France. He was deeply in debt to them, and he ruthlessly wanted to dismantle the order and grab their immense wealth.
So how did he go about it? What were the accusations?
In 1307, the charges were unleashed. They were incredibly specific, sensational, designed to shock and horrify everyone. Things like black magic, sodomy, and desecration of the cross and Eucharist.
Pretty standard heresy charges, maybe.
Yeah.
But the sodomy part.
That was detailed too. Accusations of obscene kisses during their secret initiation rites. Specifically, kisses on the mouth, the anus or base of the spine, the navel, even the generative member.
Wow. Very specific.
And they were also accused of renouncing Christ, spitting on the cross, worshiping cats. These weren't random. They were strategically crafted to tap into the deepest religious and social anxieties, to paint the Templars as completely depraved, blasphemous, heretical, which of course would justify destroying them in the eyes of a pious public.
And these confessions, these incredibly detailed accounts of obscene kisses and blasphemy, how reliable were they? Were the Templars really doing this, or is something else going on?
That's the absolutely crucial point, and it's where the story gets truly harrowing, these confessions, almost universally extracted under torture.
Torture.
And the purpose of torture, let's be clear, was not to obtain the actual truth, but to elicit the specific truth that the accusers wanted to hear. It was that truth or death. Phil IV and his inquisitors had a narrative they needed confirmed, and they used brutal methods to get it.
Did the Templars stick to these confessions?
Many retracted them as soon as the torture stopped, which of course makes them highly unreliable as genuine testimony. But confusingly, some did stick to parts of their confessions, even later, claiming that obscene kissing was part of the initiation.
So it's hard to know what was real.
It highlights the profound difficulty. Discerning genuine practice from coerced testimony, especially under that kind of duress, it's almost impossible. We can't know what truth, if any, lies beneath the weight of that extreme pressure, or how deeply the desired story was imprinted on them. Some Templars even confessed to these supposed internal rules. They said they were told that if moved by natural heat, they might call any one of the brethren to their relief. Meaning have sex with each other. And that it would be better to satisfy their lust among themselves than if they went to women. Sometimes this was even framed as an act of contempt towards the other sex, a perverse twist to make them seem even worse.
Good grief. Any evidence this was widely known or rumored?
Well, there's one Scottish account suggesting Templar kiss was actually a known phrase among schoolboys, which implies some degree of public awareness, or at least rumor, about the knight's practices, maybe fueled by earlier whispers or just the sensational trials themselves. These rules, real or manufactured, show the cynical manipulations possible within an all-male order under intense scrutiny.
So after all the accusations, the torture, the confessions, what's the general view among historians now? Were the Templars engaged in widespread, institutionalized sodomy?
The overwhelming majority of mainstream historians dismiss the sodomy allegations as politically motivated fabrications, purely designed to destroy the order and seize its assets, not reflecting actual widespread practice, a strategic smear campaign.
But the idea of same-sex activity existed.
Oh yes. It's important to remember that male-on-male sexual activity was recognized in medieval law as a subset of sodomy. The concept existed, it was condemned. The key question isn't whether individual Templars might have engaged in same-sex acts that's possible in any large single-sex institution, especially one forbidding marriage. The question is whether it was institutionalized behavior, part of the order's fabric, or just a convenient, devastating accusation used by a king who wanted them gone.
So a political weapon.
A stark example of it. How sodomy accusations could be used to delegitimize and destroy powerful groups by tapping into those deep anxieties about unnatural acts. The confessions ripped out by torture show how fragile truth is in those situations. The whole case tells us far more about the accusers and the political climate than necessarily about the accused Templars themselves. It demonstrates how deviance could be constructed and deployed.
And this naturally brings us right back to Richard the Lionheart. If these accusations were such potent political weapons, it really makes you wonder, how do modern historians even start to untangle the truth about Richard's private life, centuries later? It feels like navigating a minefield of bias.
It's incredibly challenging, and that's precisely why Richard's sexuality is still this deeply contentious battleground in modern history writing. The debates actually reveal as much about our contemporary anxieties, our cultural values, as they do about the 12th century.
So what are the main sides of the argument today?
Well, on one side, you have very respected historians like John Gillingham. He's a leading voice, arguing that the whole idea of Richard being homosexual is a recent bit of rather questionable historiography.
Recent? How recent?
He points out it was first really asserted in 1948 by J.H. Harvey. Gillingham basically calls it a new legend, which tells us more about our own times than it does about the character of the man.
So he thinks it's an invention.
Essentially. He and historian Thomas Asbridge tend to dismiss the evidence we've talked about, the bed sharing, the public penance, as misinterpretations. Misreading medieval customs or taking biblical references like Sodom too literally when they might just mean general vice. For them, applying our modern sexual categories like gay or homosexual to a pre-modern context is just anachronistic. It distorts the past.
So their argument is basically that we're projecting, seeing what we want to see or what fits our modern ideas about inclusivity rather than objective history.
Exactly. They'd argue we're imposing today's identity concepts onto a past that simply didn't think about sexuality in the same way.
Okay, what's the counter argument?
Well, conversely, other scholars, also those coming from queer theory perspectives or social history, take a very different view. They argue that the evidence for Richard's fluid sexuality, or as I henceforth call it, his queerness, is both clear and extensive, even if you add all the necessary caveats about understanding same-gender relations back then.
And they address the proof issue.
Yes, they critique what they see as that problematic modern demand for concrete proof for pre-modern queer lives. They argue that those medieval chroniclers did have reason to believe Richard's relationships, or his sins, were sexual, and the suggestive way they wrote about it is highly significant.
So the absence of modern labels doesn't mean the absence of the experience.
Precisely. For them, just because terms like gay or bisexual didn't exist doesn't mean queer experiences, behaviors, maybe even a nascent sense of shared identity didn't exist. It's about recognizing the signals that medieval people themselves would likely have understood.
It sounds like this debate gets tangled up with Richard's image as a hero, too.
Oh, deeply. It's absolutely intertwined with his political and cultural legacy, his status as this English national hero. For some observers, denying his potential queerness can look like an effort to rehabilitate him as a good king, maybe keep that heroic image untarnished.
Or even distance modern Britain from the Crusades.
Possibly. Some argue there's a link, maybe subconscious, especially post 9/11, with the legacy of Western intervention in the Middle East being so fraught. Keeping the Crusader hero clean might serve a purpose.
So the key takeaway is
That historical interpretation is never truly neutral. It's always influenced by contemporary anxieties, national stories, cultural values, not just pure objective analysis. This whole historiographical battle over Richard is fascinating in itself. It shows how history is constantly being rewritten, reinterpreted through the lens of whatever concerns us now.
That's a really profound point. History isn't just a static record. It's this ongoing conversation across time, constantly being reframed. So moving beyond these specific debated incidents and the modern arguments, what else does Richard's personal life tell us? Are there other clues, maybe even contradictory ones, about his desires or relationships?
It definitely offers a broader and, more complex picture, which stops us from jumping to overly simple conclusions. For instance, he did marry Berengaria of Navarre in 1191, but their marriage was famously childless.
Could have been infertility.
Absolutely, that's always a biological possibility for either person. But medieval accounts also specifically noted Richard's neglect of his marital duties. And for a king expected to produce an heir for stability, that failure was a big deal, a matter of concern.
Okay, so childless marriage, maybe neglectful. But does that mean no heterosexual activity?
No, because despite that, Richard did father at least one illegitimate child, Philip of Cognac, born sometime after 1180.
Ah, so that proves he was capable of and engaged in heterosexual sex at least once.
Exactly. And furthermore, some chroniclers, like Walter of Gisborough, even suggest he had women brought to him on his deathbed, against his doctor's orders, which, if true, paints a picture of a man with ongoing heterosexual desires right up to the end.
What about older legends about him, before this modern debate really took off?
That's interesting, too. Prior to the 20th century, before the homosexuality question gained traction, legendary tales often depicted Richard seducing women. It reflected a view of his unbridled lechery that wasn't necessarily focused on just one gender. The preoccupation was more with his sexual appetite, its perceived excess, regardless of the object.
So, putting it all together, the male intimacies, the illegitimate child, the deathbed story, what does it suggest?
It suggests that if Richard was queer, his sexuality might have been fluid, maybe bisexual in modern terms. Or, perhaps more accurately for the time, it just indicates that medieval understandings didn't fit neatly into our modern binary boxes. The consistent concern we see throughout his life in the penances and the chronicles seems to be about his unbridled lechery, the excess, the perceived lack of control over his desires, rather than solely who those desires were directed at.
So, trying to label him definitively might miss the point.
It challenges that modern impulse to neatly categorize historical figures. It allows for a more nuanced discussion, recognizing individuals might have engaged in a whole range of behaviors without fitting the fixed identity labels we use today.
All of this really makes you think, why does any of this matter to us now? Why should we care who medieval men loved, especially a king from over 800 years ago whose specific sex life is impossible to confirm definitively?
It matters for several really profound reasons, and this is kind of the so what of this whole deep dive, isn't it? Firstly, it highlights the discomfort, maybe even resistance, that some modern historians and maybe society more broadly still have with acknowledging fluid or non-hetero narratives, especially when it comes to revered figures, those sacred national heroes.
The need for clean heroes.
Exactly. It exposes what he might call the danger of needing clean heroes.
Yeah.
That desire for uncomplicated, idealized figures often leads us to sanitize history, to deny complex realities. It reflects our own anxieties about masculinity, power, national identity.
What else?
Secondly, by digging into medieval attitudes towards sexuality, especially how the church doctrine hardened, we get a better handle on the historical roots of repression. We see how moral panics and accusations like against the Templars weren't just about morality. They were used as powerful political weapons, shaping public opinion, justifying persecution, even destroying powerful institutions.
And it helps us think about applying labels.
Yes. Thirdly, it pushes us to challenge anachronism. By wrestling with the nuances of medieval sexuality, we learn to be careful about applying historical context, to avoid just slapping modern identity labels onto the past inappropriately. But, and this is crucial, it also allows us to still recognize that queer experiences did exist, even if they weren't talked about with our language or categorized in our way. We can see the traces, the signals, even if the labels are modern.
And finally,
and maybe most importantly, reclaiming these often hidden histories reveals something powerful. That despite severe condemnation, queer desires found ways to be expressed, even covertly. It speaks to the resilience of individuals, the existence of these coded subcultures, navigating hostile environments, finding ways to communicate, to simply exist. Ultimately, this whole story is about how history gets written, how it's interpreted, how it's often shaped by our present-day anxieties, our national narratives, our cultural values. It's about acknowledging the complex, often hidden dimensions of human experience across all of time. It pushes us to see the past, and maybe ourselves, with more open and critical eyes. Hashtag outro.
wow, what an incredible deep dive into the really contested legacy of Richard the Lionheart. We've explored those whispers around his sexuality, tried to peel back the layers of myth and historical perception. We've delved into the complex, nuanced forms of medieval male intimacy, understanding how that brotherhood in knightly culture could foster these incredibly profound bonds, sometimes, with homoerotic undertones, even alongside official condemnation. We've seen the church's stance evolve, getting harsher, framing sodomy as a crime against nature, linking it to heresy, leading to brutal consequences. And we've learned how easily accusations of sexual deviance could be weaponized for political control, the Templars being that chilling example. All of it reminding us that even today, in modern history writing, these debates are alive and well, revealing maybe as much about our own biases and anxieties about who our heroes are allowed to be, how we choose to remember them.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it leaves us with a thought, doesn't it? Maybe Richard loved a man. Maybe he didn't. We can't know for sure. But either way, he lived in a world where he couldn't say it, where even a hint could be twisted and used against him. And we live in a world where sometimes we still hesitate to even imagine it for figures like him, even while we claim to be more open, more accepting. What does that hesitation tell us about our own ongoing anxieties around masculinity, around power, and around the stories we choose to believe about our past?
That is definitely a question worth pondering. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into what we called Richard the Lionheart's Brokeback Crusade. If you're curious and want to explore the source material, the scholarship we touched on today, you can find more information and links in our show notes. Until next time, keep diving deep.